Late autumn 2025. Rheinstedt, a small village at the foot of the Harz Mountains in Saxony-Anhalt, Germany. A routine archaeological survey was underway, the kind required by law before any large-scale construction can begin. Wind turbines were planned for the site, and before the foundations could be laid, the ground had to be checked for buried remains. In most cases, nothing turns up. The soil is sampled, the forms are signed, and the builders move in. This time was different. When the team from the Saxony-Anhalt State Office for Heritage Management and Archaeology stripped back the topsoil, they found a trapezoidal ditch cut into the earth beneath. Its shape and depth matched the burial enclosures of the Bavaria culture, a Neolithic farming community that occupied Central Europe roughly 6,000 years ago, known for enclosing their dead within distinctive, ditched boundaries. On its own, this was a significant find. But at the southern end of the ditch, something else emerged. Something that had no business being there. An oval opening, roughly 2 meters long and 75 centimeters wide. Beyond it, a narrow passage carved into the loess, its walls smoothed as though shaped by hand. The ceiling was so low that a grown man would have to stoop to pass through. Inside, the archaeologists recovered a horseshoe, the near-complete skeleton of a fox, a scattering of small mammal bones, and traces of charcoal from a fire that had burned briefly and gone out. Pottery fragments found in the fill dated the tunnel's construction to the later Middle Ages, somewhere between the 12th and 14th centuries. A medieval tunnel carved into the floor of a 6,000-year-old tomb. The archaeologists knew immediately what they were looking at. An Erdstall. The word is German, meaning roughly, a place in the earth, and it refers to a particular type of narrow, short underground passage believed to date from the medieval period. They have been found across Bavaria, Austria, Bohemia, France, Ireland, and England. At least 2,000 have been identified so far, and the true number is almost certainly far higher. 2,000 tunnels, spread across nearly every corner of Europe, built, by all available evidence, during the Middle Ages. And here is the strange part. Not merely strange, this is the heart of the mystery. Not one of these tunnels appears in a single medieval document. Not in monastic chronicles, not in parish visitation records, not in manorial surveys, not in episcopal reports. The word Erdstall does not appear. No reference to their construction, their purpose, or their prohibition. Digging 2,000 underground passages would have required considerable labour and time, yet no community's records make any mention of the work. The medieval world was a world of records. Monks noted the weather. Parish priests recorded every baptism, marriage, and burial. Lords catalogued every tree on their estates. And in that world of obsessive documentation, thousands of tunnels were dug, and not a single line was written about them. Someone chose not to record them, or someone erased the record, or these tunnels existed entirely outside the system that produced records in the first place. Back at the excavation site, the team carefully cleared the soil from inside the passage. The fox skeleton lay almost intact, as though it had been placed there rather than having wandered in to die. The horseshoe sat near the entrance. The charcoal was found midway along the tunnel, close to the wall. The fire, the report noted, had burned briefly. A short-lived fire, a narrow passage, animal bones, and a tomb 6 millennia old. Someone came here, they lit a flame, and they left. When it happened, why it happened, how many of them there were, none of this is known. What is certain is that they wrote nothing down, and nobody wrote anything about them. This is the Erdstall mystery, And it is not the story of one tunnel beneath one German field. Across the whole of Europe, beneath the soil, 2,000 silences are still buried. The Erdstall tunnels first attracted scholarly attention in the late 19th century. Bavarian farmers kept stumbling on hollow spaces beneath their fields, turning the plough and finding the ground give way, or breaking through into voids while extending a churchyard wall. Local antiquarians began noting these discoveries, but for decades the tunnels were treated as little more than regional curiosities. Each one seemed too small, too plain, too unremarkable to warrant serious investigation. Then, from the latter half of the 20th century, systematic surveys began to reveal a pattern that was anything but unremarkable. The current tally stands at roughly 700 in Bavaria, 500 in Austria, and several hundred more scattered across France, Bohemia, Ireland, Britain, Spain, and Hungary. More than 2,000 confirmed sites in total. And running through all of them is an architectural grammar of striking consistency. First, every Erdstall is narrow. The passages typically measure between 60 and 80 centimeters across, with a ceiling height of 1 to 1.5 meters. You cannot walk through one upright. You crouch or you crawl. Second, the passages are carved into smooth oval cross-sections. This is not the ragged profile of a natural cave or a hastily dug bolt hole. The shaping is deliberate, even careful. Third, and this is the feature that unsettles researchers most, many Erdstall tunnels contain what is known as a schlupf. A schlupf is an abrupt constriction in the passage, a bottleneck where the width drops below 40 centimeters and the tunnel shifts sharply, either vertically or horizontally. To get through a schlupf, a grown adult must press their arms flat against their body, lead with one shoulder, and twist their entire frame through the gap. Consider this for a moment. If these tunnels were refuges, hiding places dug against raiders or invaders, why would anyone build an internal bottleneck so tight that even the people hiding inside could barely squeeze through? If you wanted to keep enemies out, you would narrow the entrance. You would not create a choke point halfway along that effectively traps your own people. And if the tunnels were storage chambers for food or valuables, this structure makes even less sense. You would want easy access, not a passage that forces you to contort yourself every time you need to reach what you have stored. There is another pattern too: location. A significant proportion of confirmed Erdstall tunnels are found near churches, cemeteries, or prehistoric sites. Rheinstedt is the most dramatic example, but across Bavaria, many tunnels have been discovered immediately adjacent to parish churches or within the bounds of village burial grounds. Some begin directly beneath the foundations of church buildings, tunnels beside churches, passages beneath graveyards, pathways carved into ancient tombs. The refuge theory does not sit comfortably with this. Sheltering next to a church during a raid would hardly be a safe strategy. The positioning must follow a different logic. Local oral traditions offer a clue. In Bavarian farming communities, these tunnels were long known as the homes of the Schaseln, small underground beings from regional folklore. In parts of Austria, they were called Seelenwege, paths of the soul, and it was believed that the spirits of the dead travelled through them. In France, similar structures, known as souterrains, carry legends of fairy tunnels and passages to the other world. In other words, memory of the Erdstall tunnels does survive, but it survives only in speech, never in writing. This is deeply unusual. In medieval Europe, virtually every significant construction project left a documentary trace. Build a bridge, and the parish recorded it. Raise a wall, and the Lord entered it in his accounts, found a church, and the bishop was notified. Monasteries kept records of how many loaves they baked. Yet a construction effort that may have involved entire village communities, repeated thousands of times across the breadth of a continent, produced not a single written reference. Two possibilities present themselves. The first is that the people who built the Erdstall tunnels were entirely outside the literate world. Illiterate peasants working without the knowledge of clergy or lords. But this sits uneasily with the fact that thousands of tunnels across vast distances share the same building techniques. Literacy may have been absent, but some channel of knowledge transfer clearly existed. The second possibility is that those who controlled the written record, the church, the monasteries, the parishes, knew about the tunnels and chose not to write about them. If this second possibility is true, the question becomes, why? In the next part, we look at what the Schlupf might have meant, and where medieval theology, pre-Christian ritual, and underground darkness converge. Modern researchers who have physically crawled through a Schlupf passage describe a strikingly consistent sensation. It feels, they say, like being born again, forcing your body into the tight gap, drawing breath in the smell of damp earth, twisting your shoulders through and emerging into the slightly wider chamber beyond. The experience is physically uncomfortable, but psychologically it touches something very old. A passage from dark to light, from confinement to release, from one state into another. This observation has led a number of scholars to propose that the Schlupf was not a defensive feature at all, but a ritual device, a physical mechanism for symbolic rebirth. To understand this idea, we need to step back and consider how medieval Europeans understood the afterlife. From the late 12th century onwards, the doctrine of purgatory was gaining formal definition across the Western Church. Confirmed as dogma at the Second Council of Lyon in 1274, purgatory described an intermediate state between heaven and hell, a condition in which the souls of the dead underwent a process of purification before they could enter the presence of God. It was a place of suffering, but also of hope. The pain had an end. The passage led somewhere. As the doctrines spread, popular imagination began to conceive of purgatory in strikingly physical terms. The most famous example is St. Patrick's Purgatory on Station Island in Lough Derg, Ireland. From at least the 12th century, pilgrims travelled to this tiny island to enter a cave believed to be a literal entrance to purgatory. They descended into darkness, endured a night underground, and emerged the following day, symbolically cleansed. The passage was narrow, the darkness was total, and the act of coming back out into the light was understood as a rehearsal of the soul's eventual liberation. The structural parallels with an Erdstall tunnel are remarkable. Enter through a narrow opening, pass through a dark corridor, force yourself through an impossibly tight constriction, emerge into a wider space on the other side. If the Erdstall tunnels were a physical enactment of the purgatorial passage, a way for the living to rehearse in their own bodies what the soul would undergo after death, then several otherwise puzzling features suddenly make sense. The location near churches and cemeteries, the absence of stored goods or signs of habitation, the Schlupf itself, too narrow for any practical purpose, but perfectly shaped for an experience of constriction and release. But here we reach a critical fork. If the Erdstall tunnels were spaces for purgatorial ritual, were they sanctioned by the Church? Or were they something the Church never authorized and never wanted to acknowledge? The distinction matters enormously. Purgatory, as doctrine, was a powerful instrument for the institutional Church. Through purgatory, the clergy controlled access to the mechanisms of salvation: indulgences, masses for the dead, prayers that could shorten a soul's suffering. The entire system depended on the Church's role as intermediary. If ordinary people could bypass the clergy and physically enact their own passage through purgatory by crawling through a tunnel in the earth, the Church's monopoly on that process would be undermined. This is not a question of theology. It is a question of power. The Rheinstedt tunnel sharpens the problem further. This Erdstall was not merely near a church. It was carved into the floor of a 6,000-year-old burial enclosure, a space that predated Christianity by millennia. The Baalberger culture's funerary ditch was a pagan site in the most literal sense of the word. It is unlikely that medieval people had entirely forgotten what such places were. Far more probable is that the knowledge persisted through oral tradition, a sense that this was ground where old forces lingered. Digging a tunnel into a pre-Christian burial site, shaping it so that the passage mimics a journey through death and back. Doing this outside the walls of the church, without a priest, without a sacrament. From the perspective of the medieval church, this was not orthodox devotion. It was something far more troubling. The decades following the Fourth Lateran Council of 1215 saw a systematic effort by the Church to bring every aspect of spiritual life under clerical supervision. Unofficial relics were suppressed. Unapproved pilgrimage sites were discouraged. Parish priests were given detailed lists of superstitious practices to identify during confession. Among the recurring items on those lists, performing ritual acts at places not consecrated by the Church. If the Erdstall tunnels were spaces for unsanctioned spiritual practice, the Church's refusal to record them begins to make sense. To record something is, in a certain light, to acknowledge it. To write a thing into a chronicle is to admit that it exists, that it matters, that it has a place in the order of the world as the chronicler understands it. If the Church did not wish to grant the Erdstall tunnels that recognition, the most effective response was not prohibition, but silence. What kind of power was exercised through the act of not recording? That is the question we take up next. To understand the silence surrounding the Erdstall tunnels, we first need to grasp a fundamental truth about medieval record-keeping. In the Middle Ages, writing something down was never simply a matter of preserving information. It was an act of authority. The monk in the scriptorium, composing the year's entry in the Abbey Chronicle, was not merely a clerk. He was the person who decided what deserved to be remembered and what deserved to be forgotten. When a parish priest recorded a baptism, a marriage, or a death, he was defining the official boundaries of his community's existence. A person whose name did not appear in the parish register was, from the Church's perspective, as good as invisible. The same principle applied to events. A recorded event became something that had happened. An unrecorded event became something that had not. When we read a medieval chronicle, what we must never forget is that the gaps matter as much as the entries. The silence around the Erdstall tunnels needs to be read in this light. A useful comparison can be drawn from another area of medieval church practice. One of the most telling examples of organized non-recording in the Middle Ages concerns unofficial holy sites. During the 12th and 13th centuries, local shrines that had not received church approval springs said to produce miracles, trees associated with healing, caves where visions were reported, became enormously popular among ordinary people. The Church's response is instructive. Before resorting to inquisitorial suppression, the preferred strategy was often simply to say nothing. If a bishop's visitation record made no mention of a particular site, then officially that site was not a place of miracles. The cures were not cures. The pilgrimages were not pilgrimages. They were merely the wanderings of the superstitious. This is the power of non-recording. More effective than a ban, more thorough than a condemnation. The same strategy may well have been applied to the Erdstall tunnels. It is difficult to believe that the Church was wholly ignorant of their existence. Many of the tunnels are located directly beside church buildings or within parish burial grounds. If entire communities were involved in their construction, and the sheer number of tunnels suggests this, then parish clergy would have been perfectly aware of what was happening in their own churchyards. They knew, and they did not write it down. The artifacts recovered from the Rheinstedt tunnel add a suggestive dimension to this interpretation. Consider the fox skeleton. The fox occupies a very particular place in the folklore of medieval Europe. It is an animal of cunning, certainly, but also an animal of boundaries. It moves between the world above ground and the world below. It hunts at the edges of day and night. In certain regional traditions, the fox served as a guide between the realms of the living and the dead. The presence of a fox skeleton inside the tunnel might be coincidental. The animal may have crawled in of its own accord and died there. The excavation report is careful not to rule this out. But the bones were found in a near-complete, orderly arrangement, more composed than you would typically expect of an animal that had died naturally in a confined space. The possibility of deliberate placement, a ritual offering, cannot be dismissed. The horseshoe points in a similar direction. Across European folk tradition, the horseshoe is one of the oldest protective talismans. It wards off malign spirits. It brings fortune. Throughout the Middle Ages, horseshoes were commonly buried in the foundations of buildings, including churches, as a form of symbolic protection. Finding one at the entrance to the tunnel suggests an intentional act. Someone placed it there to guard the threshold. Fox bones, a horseshoe, a briefly burning fire. Taken individually, each of these finds is modest. Taken together, they compose a scene. Someone entered this tunnel. They placed a protective object at the entrance. They lit a flame inside. They passed the bones of a boundary animal. And they left. Whatever they did in there, they did not stay long. The charcoal evidence points to a fire that burned only briefly. Not the hearth of someone sheltering overnight, but the flame of someone passing through. And all of it, whatever it was, went unrecorded by the Church. The brevity of the fire is worth pausing over. It tells us this was not a dwelling, it was not a storehouse. It was a space entered and exited, an act performed and completed. The fire served the moment, and the moment ended. Everything about the evidence points to transit, not residence. A single, purposeful visit. The Church classified practices of this kind under the broad heading of superstitio, superstition. The pastoral manuals distributed to parish priests after the Fourth Lateran Council included detailed catalogues of superstitious behaviours to be identified during confession. Among the standard entries, performing ritual acts at sites not consecrated by the Church. But here is the paradox. If the Church wished to suppress these practices, it first needed to document them. The records of inquisitorial proceedings are full of painstaking descriptions of unofficial rituals, every detail preserved as evidence for judgment. Yet in all of the surviving inquisitorial literature, there is no mention of the Erdstall tunnels. None. What does this absence mean? Either the Church classified the tunnels as superstitious, but chose not to prosecute, or the use of the tunnels was conducted so discreetly that it evaded even the inquisitor's attention. Either way, the result is the same. 2,000 tunnels. Systematic silence. The strongest circumstantial evidence that this silence was deliberate rather than accidental lies not in any document that survives, but in the very shape of the absence itself. The Erdstall tunnels are not missing from obscure or fragmentary records. They are missing from precisely the kinds of records that should contain them. And those records are otherwise thorough, meticulous, and remarkably complete. In the next part, we return to Rheinstedt and to what the soil has preserved, where the ink did not. Back to Rheinstedt, the northern foothills of the Harz Mountains, low, wind-scored farmland. Here, from late 2025, over a period of several weeks, the excavation team methodically stripped back the layers of earth. The first thing to emerge was the trapezoidal ditch, its proportions and orientation consistent with the funerary enclosures of the Balberger culture, dating to the 4th millennium before Christ. These ditches were ritual boundaries, lines drawn in the ground to separate the world of the living from the world of the dead. Then, in the southern section of the enclosure, the stratigraphy broke. About a metre below the base of the ditch, an oval opening had been cut into the loess. The walls of the passage beyond bore clear marks of tooling. Analysis of the fill revealed pottery fragments from the later medieval period, numerous stones, and small voids within the loess matrix, air pockets, indicating that the passage had once been an open space, gradually filled by natural accumulation over centuries. The excavation report confirmed the structure as an Erdstall. The evidence was unambiguous. The oval cross-section, the hand-finished walls, the proportions and form matching the established typology of Erdstall tunnels documented across Bavaria and Austria. But Rheinstedt's tunnel had something that most others do not. Finds. The overwhelming majority of Erdstall tunnels are empty. This has long been one of the most confounding aspects of the phenomenon. Thousands of artificial structures, and almost nothing inside them. No tools, no pottery, no bones, no coins, no goods of any kind. The emptiness alone strongly suggests that these spaces were not built for storage or habitation. But at Rheinstedt, the earth had been more generous. The horseshoe. Found near the entrance to the passage. Its form is consistent with later medieval ironwork, and it shows signs of use. This was a functional object before it was deposited. Its position is the telling detail. It lay at the outermost point of the tunnel, as though marking a threshold. The fox skeleton. Found further inside the passage, lying in near-complete anatomical order. A fox might plausibly have entered the tunnel and died there of its own accord. But the arrangement of the bones, composed, undisturbed, almost deliberate in their placement, sits uneasily with a natural death in a confined and awkward space. The charcoal. Found midway along the tunnel, close to the wall. A small quantity, consistent with a fire that had burned briefly and then been extinguished, or had simply gone out. Not a cooking hearth, not a warming fire. Something smaller, shorter, more intentional. Small mammal bones, found deeper in the passage. The species has yet to be confirmed through further analysis. Assembled together, These finds sketch a scene. Someone came to this tunnel. They descended into a passage carved beneath a 6,000-year-old burial enclosure. At the entrance, they placed a horseshoe, whether for protection, for marking, or for some purpose we can no longer name. Further in, they lit a fire. It burned briefly. They did not stay long. They passed the place where the fox bones lay, or perhaps placed them there themselves. And then they left. Whether this was ritual, refuge, or something we have no modern word for, cannot be established with certainty. But what can be said with confidence is this: the location was not arbitrary. This tunnel was not dug into random ground. It was dug into the floor of a tomb, a space that had been set apart for the dead 6,000 years earlier. The living cut a passage into the domain of the dead. As the archaeologist Anna Kaiser has observed, this was not a shelter. It was a deliberate intrusion into a site already understood to be sacred. The people who carved this tunnel knew, or believed, that this was not ordinary earth. It was ground where something older resided. The wider European pattern now locks into place. Erdstall tunnels cluster around churches, cemeteries, and prehistoric sites. They are drawn to places already marked by death or sanctity. The Rheinstedt example is the most vivid illustration of a tendency visible across the entire distribution. These tunnels were not dug where it was convenient. They were dug where it mattered. If we accept this, that the Erdstall tunnels were deliberately sited at locations of spiritual significance, then their purpose begins to clarify. These were not practical spaces. They were sacred ones. Built outside the church's official framework, without clerical sanction, in places that carried meaning older than Christianity itself. Spaces where ordinary people could descend into the dark, pass through a narrow constriction, and return to the surface, enacting, in their own bodies, a journey through death and back again. Without a priest, without a sacrament, without permission. And precisely because of this, the tunnels were never written into the record. The church's documentary apparatus existed to chronicle the church's world. What happened outside that world, beneath it, literally, was left to the earth. 2,000 tunnels. No record. Not because nobody noticed, but because the structure of medieval authority required their invisibility. In the final part, we consider what this silence tells us about the Middle Ages themselves. The Erdstall tunnels remain, as of this year, an open mystery. The refuge hypothesis is weakened by the impracticality of the Schlupf and the absence of supplies or occupation debris. The storage theory is undermined by the tunnel's dimensions and layout. The ritual hypothesis is the most compelling, but it lacks the decisive evidence, a written account of what took place inside, a testimony from someone who participated, that would move it from probability to proof. The purgatorial passage theory is attractive, but the dating of some Erdstall tunnels may extend back before the formal codification of purgatory doctrine in 1274, which complicates the chronology. No single explanation has been confirmed, and perhaps the fact that none can be confirmed is itself part of what these tunnels are. What we call medieval Europe is, in truth, recorded medieval Europe. Monastic chronicles, church registers, royal charters, papal bulls. The Middle Ages as we know them are a composite of what literate people chose to write down. And literate people, for the most part, were clergy. The criteria for what merited recording were shaped by the Church's understanding of the world. Everything that fell outside this framework, the spoken traditions of farming communities, unofficial rituals, spiritual practices the Church did not sanction, the collective memory of people who never learned to write, belongs to what might be called the unrecorded continent of the Middle Ages. The Erdstall tunnels are among the most physically tangible evidence that this continent existed. 2,000 tunnels built to a shared architectural grammar across the breadth of Europe. This was not the isolated eccentricity of a single village. It was a cultural practice, widely distributed and remarkably consistent. Some form of knowledge transfer, oral tradition, traveling craftsmen, pilgrims carrying techniques from one region to another, carried the method of building these tunnels across borders, across generations, across linguistic divides. This was a network. It ran parallel to the Church's Latin manuscript culture, and it left not a single written trace. Let us return, one final time, to Rheinstedt, the northern edge of the Harz Mountains, a wind-swept rise of farmland. 6,000 years ago, the people of the Baalberger culture came here, cut a ditch into the earth, and made a space for their dead. Millennia passed. The ditch filled. The grass grew over it. The world above changed beyond recognition. Then, sometime in the 12th, 13th, or 14th century, someone came back. They found the place, or perhaps they had always known where it was. They dug into the old ditch and carved a tunnel. They smoothed the walls into an oval. They placed a horseshoe at the entrance. They went inside. They lit a fire. The flame burned briefly, then went out. They left. Whatever they felt in that passage, fear or cleansing or comfort, or the nearness of something they could not name, it was never written down. Their name was not recorded. The date was not noted. The purpose was not explained. 6,000 years of burial and silence, the Neolithic ditch and the medieval tunnel, and between them, all the time and all the unnamed acts that the soil covered over and the grass grew across and the wind passed through. But the tunnel is still there. Across Europe, more than 2,000 of them are still there. Narrow, dark, and empty, but present. Waiting beneath the fields, the churchyards, the car parks, the ploughed land. What we know about the Middle Ages is limited to what the records permit. Beyond the records, another Middle Ages existed. In places the church bells did not reach. In experiences the scriptorium ink could not capture. Underground, in narrow passages, in the dark, by the light of a single flame, people held their own faith, and their own fear, and their own hope. And none of it was written down. The Erdstall tunnels are the entrance to that silence. And when the excavation team at Rheinstedt opened that entrance again in the closing weeks of 2025, what came out was not treasure and not text. A horseshoe, the bones of a fox, the trace of a fire that burned once, briefly, and went out, and a question that 2,000 tunnels share. The greatest mystery of the Middle Ages may not be its monsters or its curses. It may be the question of why the things that were never recorded at all.